Every child should feel their innate worth from beginning to end. And I think, again, with that, every adoption should be celebrated. Every child is valued.
You're listening to CarSeat Questions, a podcast for parents of curious kids. I'm Lauren.
And I'm Eddie. And if you're anything like us, you either have a kid or you care for a kid with questions. Questions about all sorts of things.
So, for the next half hour, hop into the passenger seat, buckle your belt, and become childlike with us as the Lord takes us where He wants us to go.
Enjoy the show.
Sarah.
Hi.
Hi. We are just really excited to have you. There's a lot of reasons we want to have you to talk about this today. But first, can you introduce yourselves to the listeners and who you are and a little bit of your story?
Sure. My name is Sara Lane. I was once a Scarland, so Sarah's Garland if you're an alumni. Woo woo. My husband and I moved out of Chicago in 2018 after being students of Moody Bible Institute and getting married and living there for 4 years together. We decided that we wanted to change. We wanted to not have our kids in the city. So we decided to kind of throw a dart at a dartboard and landed in Maine. So we've been here for almost 5 years, which is wild to think about. It'll be 5 years in February. And we have 2 daughters, 4 and 2, and expecting our 3rd baby in May.
Woo woo.
Woo woo. I'm a stay-at-home mom. My husband is a welder at a welding place here in town. We are active members of our church and lead a very quiet and peaceful life right now.
And Sarah and her husband Aiden are some of our very best friends. So
yes,
we're so excited and pleased to have Sarah with us. So today we're going to talk about interracial adoption, which, Sarah, if you want to kind of tell us a little bit of your backstory with interracial adoption.
So my story begins in 1988. I was born in January, which is the summer in Colombia. So I was born in Bogota, Colombia, to a very young girl. I actually know very little about my birth mother. I didn't have an official birth certificate or birth document, to my knowledge, until many years later when I went searching for it. The story was basically that she was very young and she abandoned me to a convent, and they took me in, as is their duty. My birth mother named me Monica. And at the time, Colombia was in a kind of a state of, it was just a mess. It was very violent. The drugs were just a thing that, everybody knew about. It was the United States was fighting against the drugs in Colombia. And so Colombia was a mess. And so a lot of families would send their young daughters to the capital of Colombia to work for the rich people. They'd send them to Bogota, they'd send them to Medellin, or they send them to the coast. Because that's where the big money was. And so the story was that there were a lot of babies being born out of situations that were less than ideal. And this was most likely my story. Like I said, I don't know for sure. We just know that my mother was very young. What I think as a mother now, when I think of her having a baby very young, continuing with a pregnancy that she knew she would eventually not be able to love this child. I think it's extremely humbling that my birth mother chose the greatest act of love was to give me to somebody else to take care of. So yes, kind of bouncing around. My adopted parents, Earl and Valerie. My dad is an immigrant from Norway, and my mom is American. She's actually like the only person born on American soil, so she is the true American of her family. So my dad arrived to the United States in 1964, and he met and married my mom, who was a nurse in upstate New York. And their story is a special one on its own, but my mom has lupus, and they tried for years to have kids. And due to the disease, they were unable. And so they did the fertility treatments. They went through, and again, at that time, all of this was fairly new. Um,
Yeah.
and so, it's not like today, 35 years later, things are very different in the fertility world.
Mm.
But my parents could not have kids. And so rather than continuing to fight for that dream, they just stopped, which I actually think was very bold and brave, because they kind of accepted this isn't going to happen this way, but we want children. My parents are both believers. And so they started with my older brother. So I'm one of three adopted children. My older brother's name is Eric. He was born in Chile in 1986. Again, very similar situation. All of our birth mothers gave us up because they could not provide a life that they thought was acceptable for a child. Um, so they adopted my brother at, I want to say 7 weeks. He was very small,
Oh, wow.
malnourished. He came at 7 weeks old. He weighed 11 pounds.
Oh my gosh.
So,
Wow.
so just really, just not great
Yeah.
situations. But my parents worked with an adoption agency based out of New York City. And they dealt with adoptions in Latin America. And I've asked my parents, like, well, why the Latinos? Like, what was your thing with them? And my mom was just like, we didn't care. Like, you could have come from anywhere.
Mm.
We knew we wanted children, and we knew we wanted to love someone else's children in the way that we were supposed to and God asked us to. And so it just so happened that adoption agency just worked with little Latino babies. Um, so, and I think I'm like, you just wanted the most beautiful of us, but whatever. um, so my parents, so they adopted Eric when he was 7 weeks old. In 88, they adopted me from Colombia. And I was 5 months old. I actually came in a hip brace. So again, like, I wasn't healthy. And then my younger brother, Gabriel, is from Guatemala.
Thanks for sharing with us. I know that's sensitive and personal, so I really appreciate you sharing with that us. I think
Absolutely.
with that with us. I think that'll help our listeners just get an idea of who you are and that this is your lived experience, and so you are the expert and the person that should be talking about this with us. I think this kind of has started to come to my mind a lot. One of my coworkers has a son that they adopted from China. And so he's always just kind of telling stories about his son and where he's at. And I think he's 6 or 7 now. And he told me 2 stories that I want to share with you. One was they were at an Asian restaurant eating noodles. And he said, Papa, you can't use chopsticks, only me because I'm Chinese. And so, which is
That's so
so
cute.
sweet and
Yeah.
cute because he's recognizing this is a Chinese or an Asian culture thing and you're not. And so that for me was oh, kids are picking up on these things,
Yeah.
even at young ages of cultural differences too.
Right.
And then the other story he told was, this was somewhat recently, is he's starting to realize how they look differently. And so he actually went up to his dad and he pushed his eyelids back and he said, oh, you look like me now. And is oh, you're starting to recognize that most children look like their biological parents and you don't
Right.
look like us. And so just another tender moment of
Yes.
a small person realizing, oh, there's something different here. And at that age, I'm not sure what it is, but I'm realizing and recognizing the difference in us, even as a family.
Yes.
So that's kind of where we want to go with you today, is just talking about how to care for the hearts and minds of children that are a part of an interracial adoption, that have been adopted by a family that does not look like them. And so if it's all right, we just want to kind of ask you some questions about your experience or even
Absolutely.
what you would do today if you were, adopting someone of a different race. So what if a child came up to you and asked, why do people look different than me? Why do the people in this family look different than me? What do you feel is a caring way for their tiny little hearts and minds to answer that and be honest, but still answer the question?
That's so much to unpack, right?
I
Because
know.
there's so many different colors and looks and shapes and sizes. But when you're talking about a child, even with my girls who despite my dark features, don't actually really look like me. They have features that belong to me, but both of my girls are like blonde and hazel eyes. And
Yeah.
so they've also asked me a very similar question. And granted,
Mm.
I bore them, right? And so I've kind of um,
Yeah.
thought about this question. So for me growing up, I have dark skin, I have dark hair and dark eyes, and both of my parents look very Nordic, like
Hmm.
petite, blonde, blazing blue eyes. And so this was a question that I asked my mom all the time. And when you gave me this question to think about, I thought about her response to me, which was her first answer was how much she loved me. I love you.
Hmm.
I am your mama and I love you. And you
Hmm.
look different from me because that's how God made us. And so growing up, my
Mm.
mom was a knitter and a sewer. Um, and so she'd have this like spread of knitting magazines and sewing magazines. And I can remember looking through them. And a lot of those magazines growing up had pictures of like mommy and me. They have
Mm.
like the mom pattern and then the kid pattern. And I can distinctly remember looking through this Vogue knitting magazine and seeing these mommies and me, and they all looked the same. And I don't even know how old I was. I couldn't have been older than 4. And I looked at her and I was like, why don't I look like you? And she didn't, it's really hard to like have a concrete answer
Yeah.
other than God gave us you. And in this part of the world,
Mm.
this is how these people look. And she went
Mm.
to another book. It was probably like an encyclopedia. And we looked at Latin America and we looked at pictures of people who looked like me. And that was the first time I remember looking at Colombia on the map. And now, granted,
Hmm.
I can't, you as a child, you're not expected to fully understand all that it meant. But it did give me a place. And she also took the time to show me other pictures of people who looked like me from that area. And so I think when you're talking to a child, don't discredit their intelligence. Um, because a child who is
Yeah.
old enough will ask that question.
Hmm.
And so if they're asking the question, don't give them, oh, it's just because you're special. And I think you're beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They actually have the brains to conceptualize probably more than you're going to give them credit for. And so I would encourage a parent to take the time to say, actually, this, from your friend, these are how people look in China. Look how beautiful.
Hmm.
And understanding that this is what Americans look like, even though Americans are all over the map, but like,
Hmm.
or
Yeah.
this is what Nordic people look like. And so allow them to explore that in a place of safety. And it's okay to say, I don't know. It's how God made
Hmm.
us. We all look different and that is okay.
Yeah.
Um, so I think, again, just rather than trying to dumb down an answer, because it is a hard
Mm.
question. Why do I
Yeah.
look the way I look? Why do we look different? Well, God gave us and put you in our family. The people where you
Hmm.
come from look like this. Look how beautiful.
I think you saying God, your mom saying God put you in our family is so sweet. That is like such a sweet way to say that. To say like we're different, but like God put you here, so you're meant to be here, and it's like
Yes.
another way to reassure that you belong here, that you are a part of this
Yes.
family and you belong with us, even if you don't look like us.
Right.
I think it's fascinating how children ask these questions. And something important you said, Sarah, was like, I think sometimes we fail children in discrediting
Hmm.
their intelligence or discrediting how much they actually understand.
Right.
But the way they see the world isn't wrong. It's just coming from
Right.
a very literal sense, right? And
Hmm.
so they
Yes.
are asking questions based on what they can see, right? And not so much what they understand in the moment,
Right.
And so like when I hear stories like this, I'm just like, man, like he's just saying like what's given to him,
Yeah.
you know or her in this scenario, and they're genuinely curious,
Right.
and I think sometimes as adults or even as parents we're like caught off guard, like you don't understand how like profound the question you just asked me, you know what I
Right.
mean? And again, like we just shouldn't assume that they're not going to understand what the answer is. And
Right.
Trey he's only 2 and he understands a lot more than I and I give him credit for.
Sure.
So I think I'm just like really learning that.
Yeah.
Um, just on the fly as a parent.
Yes. Yes.
Um, with being, again, adopted into a family from a different culture, a different part of the world,
Hmm.
in your experience, how did you navigate, um, like being a part of both cultures, right? Because now, like, both of those cultures are yours.
Right.
It's not like
Mm.
them and me. Like, same thing for our son. Trey is going to be both from Lauren's family and from my family background. So, like, in your experience, how did you navigate those cultural differences, but also make the connections with
Mm.
both?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, I think throughout this conversation, I think I need to preface my answer with I was truly blessed to have parents who loved the Lord, who
Yeah.
loved each other, and who loved us deeply. And so that is not everybody's story, but that
Hmm.
happens to be mine. And so, so much of my family and cultural bringing was because we had parents who cared about both worlds. So
Mm.
culturally, I was raised actually Norwegian. Um,
Right.
we celebrated, Norwegian Independence Day. We celebrated our Christmas holiday in a very Norwegian style. I spent um, lots of time in Norway with my dad's family. And so that was a huge part of our lives. My mom just like, she loved that. And so there are things that I do to this day with my family that are Norwegian because it's
Mm.
how I was raised. It's part of
Yeah.
me. And then on the other side, of course, we were very American. We did the Halloween, we did the Thanksgiving, we had the 4th of July. So we kind of were all over the map when it came to like American or Norwegian culture. That being said, again, my parents were very hands on in sharing the Latino culture with us as
Mm.
best as they could. Neither
Mhm.
of them were Latino, right? And so it's not like they didn't speak Spanish. They didn't have any inkling of what really went on.
Hmm.
But they sure tried. So for instance, my mom would try to cook with like Latin spices. She would make new meals and she would go to the Colombian section of the cookbook and try that kind of meal. She'd do the same with Chile. She'd do the same with Guatemala.
Mm.
Um, we listened to a lot of different music that came from those countries. So she tried to integrate things that were part of what would have been our heritage had we stayed in our respective
Hmm.
countries. For instance, Cinco de Mayo, which is a Mexican holiday, right? So it wasn't even ours. But America does it really well, sort of. So every 5th of May, we would have a big party because we're not, all the Latinos
Yeah.
are. And so she would try, just she would really try to, if there was anything that looked remotely like Latin American, she would get us involved in that thing. There was an exhibit in Albany, and it was a Hispanic painter. Again, I don't remember who it was, but she was like, "We're going. Like this is part of who you should know who this is."
Yeah.
So she was always very excited about it. And then when we were probably I would say in 2nd grade, um, she was really very attentive in trying to teach us Spanish, which is
Mm.
hard
Mm.
to do when you're
Yeah.
in school without having an immersion.
Hmm.
It can be done, but it's hard. So again, I was raised with a very like she would try so hard to show us what it could have been like, the colors, the sounds, the music, their holidays, the flags.
Hmm.
So I think, my mom, she never shied away from it. It was never too loud. For instance, you both knew me in my younger days. Like I grew up, in a very Hispanic part of town. So it's very Puerto Rican. And all of those
Ooh.
girls have their own flair for all of the things. It was the
Yes.
nails, it was the hair, it was the
Yes.
big gold earrings, and I loved it.
Yeah.
But we lived on a
Mm.
farm, 15 miles outside of town. But I loved that, and I played basketball for the town. And I can remember being like, "Mom, like I want those nails." And I
Hmm.
remember having like sort of a trepidation about it, and she was like, "Okay, let's go get you the nails." And that was huge for me because
Yeah.
I thought she was going to
Mhm.
say no. We were a very
Mhm.
conservative family. And instead, she saw that as a part of me trying to fit into something that I wasn't quite a part of.
Yeah.
And like, so I think, again, to my parents' credit, um, when it came to trying to integrate us or like pay
Mhm.
attention to things that we were drawn to, some of is just nature. We have this nature versus nurture. Some of who I am is just,
Mhm.
it's because I'm Colombian 100%.
Mhm.
And it's
Yeah.
not because of my parents. And so like my mom and my parents were very like, yeah, let's go do that thing. If you love it, if you love the gold hoops, we'll get them for you. If you want the Fat Farm shoes, let's do it. Y'all remember
Wow,
Fat
Fat
Farm?
Oh
Farm.
my
Hey, I used to have Fat Farm cologne,
Oh
okay?
Come
my
Don't
on. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
gosh.
I hear you. So I think,
Ah,
they, again, to their credit, they did a really good job with that. So I
yeah.
grew up having a knowledge of both, I guess, all three, like the American, the
Mhm.
Norwegian, and a really hearty attempt at what Latino culture might have
Yeah.
been like.
And we know that you later in life had your own journeys into going into Hispanic places. I believe you
Mhm.
were in Colombia, right?
It
And how
was.
did you choose to do that? And like, what was that experience like for you, feeling like connecting back to your roots?
Um, Boy, the Columbia trip was its own beast,
Hmm.
because I was older and I
Right.
thought I was ready for it. By the time I went to
Mm.
Colombia, I had actually already been to the Dominican with my family.
Okay.
I'd gone to the Dominican for vacation, for mission trips. I'd been to Costa Rica. Um, and before I ever got to Colombia, because of the Spanish thing, I really, really wanted
Hmm.
to learn Spanish. So I grew up, I went to 1 year of Bible college in upstate New York. And that same Bible college has campuses all over the world. And so I went to Word of Life Bible Institute in
Hmm.
Argentina for almost 3 years to learn Spanish. And I came out
Oh,
speaking
cool.
fluently, but
Wow.
I didn't do that until I was an adult. And I think that was one of the first like steps of my own volition that
Yeah.
I took to really like taking back, I guess,
Mm.
part of who I believed I was. So after Argentina, I went to Moody. And in 2010, one of my best friends, Allie, she worked with an orphanage in Bogota. And of all the countries and of all the traveling I had done, I had yet to go to Colombia. I had yet to return.
Hmm.
And I think that was like partially a subconscious fear.
Yeah.
Um, so it was, let's see, it was the summer of 2011 between semesters that I went to Colombia on this mission trip. And I thought I was ready. Like I spoke Spanish by then, I was an adult and
Hmm.
not a child. And I went, and I think it was so much more like emotional than I had anticipated, like stepping foot in my place of birth.
Yeah.
Having left it as a baby, I didn't remember anything, nothing. Um, when I was in Argentina, other Colombians would say, "Oh my gosh, you are so Colombian! Like you look like this part of Colombia. You act exactly like us." It was a really like uncanny thing to be like,
Hmm.
I am. You know, I am with this group of people, and we are very similar, and that was strange. And so landing in Colombia um, was healing, while it was also very like soul bearing. Um,
Yeah.
I think every year on my birthday, I think of my birth mother. And, there will be unanswered questions there until the day I die. Um,
Yeah.
but I can't help but think of her, right? Like,
Hmm.
no matter what the situation, if you gave birth, you remember that birthday, right?
Yep.
And so being in Colombia, feeling a sense of responsibility, like, I don't know who she is, where she is, if she's still alive. I know nothing. So there was like guilt because I'd had this life that she afforded me. But
Hmm.
where did she end up? But I didn't have any
Yeah.
tools to find her. While also literally going. So we were working with an orphanage. So going and seeing these children
Right.
of who I should have been.
Mm.
These street kids, the majority of them, their mothers are prostitutes or drug addicts. Like that should have been my story.
Mhm.
And so
Yeah.
But for the grace of God, right? But for the
Yeah.
grace of God, it wasn't. And
Right.
so, yeah, I think Colombia was, again, like a lot
Hmm.
to deal with. But my purpose there was to kind of like come to terms with who I was and what God had written out for me, at the same time acknowledging the miraculousness of it.
Yeah, totally. How do you and how have you since since those trips and maybe even just growing up, how do you and how would you explain to another child that's adopted to hold both at the same time? Like, how can you hold growing up in a Norwegian American family and also be Colombian? How do you and would you suggest to someone else to hold two true things at once?
I see it through the lens of somebody who knows Jesus, right? And so
Yeah.
I think when I think of my answer, I'm thinking like that is all I've got. Because if you look at it through any other lens, it can be very dramatic. There are a lot of
Mm,
things that come up for someone who might not have that hope of the Lord. Because without the Lord, there are so many unknowns and so many things that are unhopeful in our world. And so when I hold my adoption, right, both my heritage and the adoptive parents, who are the only parents who've ever loved me, right, that was
mhm.
unconditional love. With the birth mom I will probably never meet,
Mhm.
um, I think the only way I can do that in a healthy way without kind of reeling, like, and asking myself these hypothetical questions that I won't have the answers to,
Yeah.
is to stay in the hope of what I do have, of the
Mhm.
story that Jesus gave me through my parents. And again, if you're talking to a child about this, well, like, because it can, you can get really deep and you can get into your head. Well, did she not love me? Why
Yeah.
did she pick me? What was the situation? I don't know. But you're here and now, and God gave you to us. And I think the only reason I have that is because it was reiterated so many times to me and my brothers. Like, it wasn't an
Mhm.
accident. We were never an accident. If
Yep.
anything, we were on this earth to be put into the family that we were in now.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think it's hard to say, like, how do we hold that tension, because I have certainly met other kids who are adopted and they don't have the story I have, or they had abusive
Mhm.
parents or whatever that may be.
Mhm.
And to look those
Yeah.
kids in the face and say, just trust in God, it can feel
Mhm.
really insincere.
Yep.
Mm.
This was God's plan for you, back. And I think that's hard, to honestly say, because I think each child at the end of the day needs to know that they are valued and
Yeah.
loved by someone, and that person is God. And so the people
Yeah.
with the worst stories, when they find Jesus, that is their only anchor.
Mhm.
And I mean that with my
Yeah.
whole heart. Like, I'm not just saying that because, like, this is a moody podcast. Like,
Yeah,
the Lord
absolutely.
knows, like,
Yes.
the Lord knows that that is my story.
Yep.
Like, there are other things in my life that, had it not been for Jesus,
Yeah.
it would have ended up very differently.
No, that's something you've always proclaimed and have always been upfront and honest about, and you don't shy away from saying. So we know and we believe you. And when you say that, you're not just saying it for today. I've like such a when I think about parents who put their children up for adoption, I have such empathy for them. I
Hmm.
think more now, like being a mom,
Yep.
it's like I have so much empathy. Like the probably heart-wrenching emotions that they had to go through to make that
Yes.
decision. And so, yeah, I just have so much empathy for your birth mom, all the birth
Yes.
moms and dads in the world who have had to make that decision, and in hopes that their biological kids are going to have a better life than they can
Right.
give them. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think I love how you have carried yourself in this conversation with
Mhm.
us, because I don't know, I can only assume, but I think as someone who's adopted, it would be very easy for you to be angry.
Mhm.
And I'm sure you've had maybe times where you were angry at your parents or your biological mom, but like the way that you talk about them now, and again,
Mhm.
we understand this is not everyone's story, but the way you talk about them now is just so, I don't know, it's like, it's so encouraging to hear how God has carried you
Mm.
through this entire process of your life, to where you can come to a point where um like you still think about your birth mom,
Mhm.
right? And you don't blame her, or you
Mm.
don't live with you know certain amount of guilt, because of it. And I think that's just also like a beautiful
Yeah.
story, right?
Yeah.
Of someone who has been, adopted into interracial family. And so we have two more questions
Okay.
we want to ask you, and they could probably just kind of go
Mhm.
together.
Yeah.
So one of them is, what would be a misconception that's not helpful
Mhm.
for kids? And what would be one thing that you would want kids to know who are either in an interracial family situation, or who are maybe close to
Mhm.
someone who is adopted into an interracial family?
I think a misconception, and there's two, and they go together. One is that the adoption should be a secret.
Mm.
A lot of people, adults, unless you're in, and this is, I guess this would apply to an adoption where the child might end up looking like their adoptive parents, right? Like if you are a white family and you adopt a white child, like you might be more inclined to keep it a secret.
Mm.
Um, but I think that um, any adoption, whether you are black, white, Hispanic, Asian, whether you're one of those parents, like, don't keep it a secret. It isn't a secret. It's not
Mm,
something that's secretive. It's a
Mhm.
joyful thing to be celebrated. And I have
Yeah.
met adults who didn't know that they were adopted.
Wow.
And that is
wow.
very, very damaging for a number of reasons.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, and so I think the more that we can normalize adoption, but also celebrate it, offer it
Yeah.
as an
Mhm.
alternative, and get it out there that there are other things to do with an unwanted child or an undesired child or whatever it may be. I think that that is something that we need to continue to just rally forth and do. But again, I
Yeah.
think a misconception is that, oh, it's a secret. No, no, it's not. Celebrate this thing.
Yeah.
It
Mhm.
changed my life. It could change
Yeah.
yours. And again, another misconception is, and then this is one that I walked through, was that I wasn't wanted. Um,
Mm.
Actually,
Mm,
on the contrary, I think most kids who end up being, especially those who are adopted as babies, were wanted
Yeah.
desperately.
Yeah.
Like you said, Lauren, like the empathy that you have for birth mothers. Like when I
Mhm.
think about my birth mother and my brother's birth mothers,
Yeah.
or um, most likely they held us. They held
Yeah.
us. They
mm,
birthed and then they gave away, and so you were wanted desperately. And in the same way, I was wanted by Earl and
Mhm.
Valerie in upstate New York desperately.
Yeah.
And so, every child should feel their innate worth, from
mm,
beginning to end. And so I think, again, with that, every adoption should be celebrated. Every child is valued. Um,
Yeah.
can you repeat the second part of the question?
yeah, you might have kind of answered it.
Yeah.
But the other one was, what was one thing you'd want kids to know about interracial
Hmm.
adoption? And I think what you said about how you would want kids to know that they are loved,
Yes.
and that they are wanted, and that's so important when you're talking about being wanted, like in a family.
Yes.
Like, yeah, I want to know that I'm loved, and I want to know that I'm wanted regardless of how I look.
Mhm.
Yes. You have a
Yeah.
place. And
Yep.
Mhm,
again, going back to one of our very first topics was, that kids understand and see more than we give them credit for. And so,
mhm,
um,
Mhm.
you know, from the very beginning, if you can give a child a place and a home and hope, they will sense that and they will feel that. And that's why they tell us when we have our kids, like, make sure you hold them close. They can feel your heartbeat. They can hear your voice,
Mm-hmm.
even in the womb. Like, from the beginning, we are meant to be loved and to love.
Yeah.
And so, as someone who is an interracial adopted person, um, that was my story. I was so loved that even though the questions came, and those questions, I think everyone can admit that their teen years are somewhat tumultuous, whether or not you're an adopted child, right?
Yeah.
And so my questions came during those awful teen years, where like,
Right.
well, did she not want me? Did you want me? Like,
Mm.
why are these things the way they are? At the end of the day, it's just on repeat. Like, we wanted you, we loved you, and that will
Mm.
cover so much. At the end of the day, if you have a place of home, that is one of the most important things you can give a child.
Thank you. It's
Come.
been a really great conversation. I try not to sit back here and blubber while you talk. So being a mom really changes you into
Yes.
someone more sensitive.
Mhm.
Yeah, I can't explain how just how blessed at least I have been
Mhm.
in this conversation with you, and with you being one of our dear friends just makes it that much
Yeah.
more special, as if we were just sitting in your kitchen right
Yeah.
now, talking about this and talking about something that is important,
Yes.
especially for our children and
Mhm.
for children who uh, might go through this.
Right.
Um, so thank you
Thank you.
for talking to us and being vulnerable. I
Absolutely.
know that's not an easy thing to do. With all of our episodes, we like to end with a benediction.
Hmm.
So if you would join me. To him who is able to do far more than we can understand, may he give us the wisdom to raise our children to first love God above all else and love others as themselves. Go in peace.
Thank you so much.